Hello, this is Matthew, and welcome to part 4 in our video series on IBM Power servers. Today, we are going to install the IBM I operating system. If there's anyone from IBM's product marketing department who was involved in renaming the operating system IBM I just want to let you know, unfortunately, that was perhaps the worst operating system name choice in the history of operating system names. Trying to search Google for the letter I when seeking information on your operating system is, I think, not something that you considered. What was wrong with OS 400? That was fine. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. We are going to install IBM I on our Power server today. If you are just hopping into part 4 here, we are going to refer back to maybe a couple of pieces of the previous videos in this series. In part 1, we reset our system to factory defaults and we created the RAID arrays, one of which we're going to be using to try to pass through a physical volume to our IBM I partition. In part 2, we talked about installing VIOS and we looked at the integrated virtualization manager, which is how we manage our partitions on our server. And then in part 3, we looked at installing our first guest operating system into a guest partition. And in that case, it was Linux. And we saw how we can add our ISO images, the CD image to install the operating system, into our virtual optical media library. We will be using bits and pieces of all of that knowledge today to install IBM I. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The process itself is reasonably straightforward. There's just a lot of time where you're sitting waiting for things to happen. So in the case of this video, we'll have the advantage that I can just fast forward through all of those. And my video editing software only lets me speed up video clips 50 times normal speed. So in some cases, I'll probably just cut segments when nothing's happening and we're just waiting. I usually just try and speed those up so that you have a continuous, non-interrupted view of the whole process when we're doing these things in my videos. But in this case, you're not missing anything. We'll just do the occasional jump cut to the future so that you don't have to sit through even the 50 times speed up of just twiddling your thumbs, waiting for something to happen. So without further ado, we will get this process started. The first thing we need to do, of course, is get our IBM I installation media. So it is shipped on a set of 6 DVDs. There's what's called the LIC, licensed internal code. And then there are the group 1 through 5 DVDs, which actually include the higher level components of the operating system, and then all of the other what are called licensed programs that are part of IBM I, some of which are included at no charge with the operating system, others of which you would require a separate license to use beyond the 60-day demo period that most of the licensed products let you try out without having the license key installed. So in video 2, in part 2, we talked about the IBM Entitled System Support Portal. So I'm going to assume that you've added your server to your inventory and that your server was in fact entitled for IBM I, and we're able to go in to our licensed software downloads and look for IBM I. There are several versions currently supported by IBM. 7.5 is the latest. It only works on Power 9 and later processors. 7.4 only works on Power 8 and later processors. 7.3 works on Power 7. So we are on a Power 7 server today. We'll grab 7.3. Regardless of which of these you use, the installation process will look exactly the same. So if you're on a Power 8, go ahead and grab 7.4. If you're lucky enough to have a Power 9 or Power 10 IBM server that you have access to, you can grab 7.5. We'll be doing 7.3 today. So if you search for that, we will find, again, as we saw with VIOS, because the server is entitled to Power VM Standard Edition in the case of my Power 7 or Power VM Enterprise in my Power 8, regardless of the operating system you choose, you're going to get the various Power VM options. There's also various add-on software for the IBM I operating system, so the XML toolkit, query for I, lots of extra stuff, but we are just looking for IBM I itself. So we'll check the box for IBM I and hit continue. And you can choose your language group. I'm choosing language group 1. And then here you get the set of options for downloading IBM I. You need the 7.3 or whatever version is appropriate, B Group 1. This is going to be a set of, I believe, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 DVDs. It may also include things like DB2 Web Query, additional program products. This CD actually has CICS, CICS, the IBM Transaction Monitor System that is one of the mainstays of the mainframe world for OS 400 for IBM I. The 7.3 IBM I includes the JDK version 7 and 8. They've since released JDK 11, but we're not going to worry about any of that today. We're just interested in sort of the core operating system and the base licensed products that were released with 7.3. So what we need are those 5 B Group 1 DVDs. And then we also need to find the licensed internal code, the LIC. And that looks like it's right here. We don't need to download the license agreement. And that's going to be called IBase01, licensed machine code. So you want B Group 1 and you want IBase1. And every once in a while, IBM does post new versions of that base licensed machine code installer. And the most significant difference recently for 7.3 is that I think after what they call a resave Q, which we're now on resave R, which is one past Q, you have the same behavior for the operating system to set a default IP address and locate the initial LAN operator console. So that may not mean anything to you now, but the behavior is now all consistent between the latest releases of 7.3, 7.4, and 7.5. And that's going to be important to how we end up connecting during the initial installation to the operator's console. So if you have an older version of 7.3, it's always worth, when you're doing a new install, going in and grabbing the latest version of the licensed machine code installer. The B groups, I don't think they really update much. It looks like B Group 1, Disk 1 might have been updated once from 0 to 10. But by and large, for any updates to the products included in the operating system, you would need to have a support contract and be able to grab the PTFs, the program temporary fixes, which are essentially the service packs, the tech refreshes, the security fixes, all of those kinds of things for your operating system. But like I said, they do occasionally post new resaves of the iBase licensed machine code installer. Okay, so you go through the process, you agree to your license terms, and again, you can download using Download Director. It does go a little bit faster, or you can just download directly from the browser. And these will come as zipped ISO images. They have a .udf extension, but that's the same as a .iso. They're just raw DVD images. You can see one of them, this number 3, is actually relatively small. The other 4 are big enough that they would definitely require a DVD, not a CD, to burn them to. But we're using our virtual optical image library, so we're not going to have to burn any DVDs at this point. And then, of course, the base licensed machine code, which is where we'll start out, is a smaller file as well. So you can download all of these. I have already downloaded them, and I have them on my computer, and they're unzipped. So we don't need to wait for that for the purposes of this video. We can just go ahead and start getting this process going. Now, I have we'll talk about IBM iAccess later, but if I look at the size of this directory, it's 11 gigs. If I connect into my VIOS server, which if memory serves, we have at 42.43. And again, parts 2 and 3 of the video series will, if you haven't seen those talk all about the VIOS server and the idea of our virtual media image library, all those kinds of things. But our home directory here on the VIOS server looks like it is about 10 gigs free, a little short of maybe 10 and a quarter gigs free. So ideally, I would like to just SCP all of these up at the same time, but that will fill up this home directory. And remember, the VIOS is AIX, and everything here, if we look at all of the mounted partitions, these are all logical volume groups in a AIX volume manager setup. So we can actually just turn up the size of the logical volume that our home partition is on. And you do that with the change fs, chfs command. And we're going to change the attribute called size. And we just need to turn it up a little. Let's turn it up to maybe 15 gigabytes. And we want to apply that to the home file system, the file system that's currently mounted on home, which is dev hd1. And of course, we're in the restricted shell. We actually do that from the real unrestricted AIX environment. So if you go OEM setup env, you'll see we're now at basically a root prompt, and the restricted shell conditions no longer apply to us. So we'll just run that command again. There we go. And the file system size has changed to 31 million blocks, which is about 15 gigs. So if you exit from the OEM setup environment, we're now back in the VIOS partition admin environment. But if we do a df-k of our home directory, we now have 15 gigs free. Perfect. So looking at our files once again, we just copy those up to the home directory of our padmin user. Remember from the last part, we need to use this -O flag if we're using a relatively recent version of OpenSSH that includes our SCP command. That enables backward compatibility with the older SCP protocol that is still in use with older OpenSSH implementations or versions. And I'm going to copy bgroup star and then that ibase image up to padmin at our VIOS server. And like we saw SCPing up our Linux installation ISO in the previous part of the video series, this is not the fastest process in the world. So we'll go ahead and fast forward to when all of these images are uploaded. All right, that was exciting. All of the DVD images are transferred up to the VIOS server. So now we will connect back to the VIOS. And we can see them all in our home directory. So we'll just stay connected to the VIOS in this terminal session. And to avoid confusion, this Debian session is left over from part 3, the Linux installation video. We don't need that anymore. So we'll just keep our connection open to the VIOS here because in addition to the next steps here where we load the images into our virtual media repository, it's going to be much quicker for us to change the DVD that is mounted in our virtual DVD drive from the command line here, rather than trying to do it through the web interface. It's just a little more cumbersome through the web interface, and we're going to be changing the CDs quite a bit. We're going to need to basically go through each of them twice, you'll see in the installation process. So as we saw in the part 3 video, where we just had one Debian installer ISO image, we need to load all of our CD, DVD images into our virtual media repository now. All right, so if we use the ls rep command, list repository, you can see we still only have that one Debian 11 ISO, which is actually mounted in VT-opt0, the optical drive in our Debian partition, up in our repository. So the command to do that, again, was make vopt, and we give it the file name, or the file name that we want with the name parameter in the repository. And again, we have to use a relatively simple naming scheme here because of length and character restrictions. Like, I don't think you can have a period in the names up in the image repository. So I usually do something just to identify the operating system and the version. So I'll just call it i7.3 in this case. And we need to load ibase, which only has 1 disk, and then the B group, which has 5 disks. So I'm just going to call it base. We'll say read only. And the file we're loading from is this ibase01 licensed machine code file. That will copy it to the image repository, and we will just do that for each of the DVD images that we just copied up here, and we'll give them a unique name so that we know which disk they are. So I'll just copy and paste in the terminal here. I'll call the rest of them i7.3, maybe group 1, and then 01 through 05. All right, so that's the 5 B group 1, and then that 1 ibase licensed machine code DVD images loaded up into our repository. So if I ls rep again, you'll now see that we have all of those images available to us. They're still in our home directory. We can go ahead and remove them so they're not taking up space because they've been safely copied into that repository. So with that, let's get the partitions set up. We'll log in to IBM. And we can go ahead and just create a new partition. I'll call this partition OS400 using the old name for the operating system. And it is an IBM I environment. So this is what completely changes the firmware, the boot process, the hardware enumeration and presentation to the operating system. So that's the magic that allows the IBM I operating system to work. Let's see, we have 64 gigs of RAM. We gave, 16 gigs to Linux. That leaves 38. I'm going to give ourselves, let's give it 24 gigs of RAM. Figure we might be using the database in IBM I, and hopefully it would cache heavily used tables, indexes, things like that. We'll give it 4 shared processors, just so that if it needs to do some heavier compute, it can. And just like before, we're going to leave Ethernet, virtual Ethernet adapter 1 linked up to that virtual Ethernet port 1. That's the machine, or that's the physical Ethernet port on the back of our machine that is physically plugged into the network. And unlike Linux, where we created a virtual disk, which was space allocated out of our storage pool, I'm actually going to assign that whole RAID logical volume we created to the OS400 partition. So I'm going to choose assign existing virtual disks and physical volumes. That should let me pick the free volume, HDisk1. Yep, there it is. So that's our 390 gigabyte RAID 5 array logical volume. That is the second set of 4 disks in our physical server. So again, a little bit different than when we created a virtual disk out of the actual VIOS storage pool. Here we're passing through a physical resource that's available from the server to VIOS that it is able to pass through and assign directly to this partition. And finally, our virtual optical device, we'll choose the first DVD that we want mounted, which is that i7 base DVD. That's our licensed internal code installation disk. So we'll just choose that. It's one less step that we have to manually do later. And that will create our virtual CD or virtual DVD drive with that disk already loaded up. So you can confirm all of your settings. I'm happy with that. You'll note we're in IBM I mode, so you're seeing a couple of different options down here than we saw when we were creating a Linux partition. In the IBM I world, it uses what are called load source adapters. That's basically the hardware interface, whether it's a RAID card, a SAS card, your storage interface that is IPLing the operating system from. So our load source adapter is our virtual storage, which is that drive that we passed through, or the optical drive. And then alternate restart adapter is if you're, for example, installing from your optical drive, which we are. So this IVM interface actually tends to manage that correctly, and it just chooses the right thing. And then our console adapter is where the management operators console will be available, and that's going to be over the virtual Ethernet network to give us a LAN operators console. So again, IVM just does the right thing and sets that all up for us. So we'll hit finish, let it create that partition, and there it is. So just like I did on the Linux partition, I'm going to edit the properties. I'm going to turn off automatically start when system starts. I like to do that manually when I power up my server. And again, the IBM I boot settings work a little bit differently than what we saw with the Linux or what we would see with AIX, where you choose your IPL source, and your options here are A, B, C, or D. A and B are the basically you're booting from the hard drives in your system. B is the temporary side, and A is the permanent side. So typically, we're going to install on our hard drive. When you apply service, when you apply patches, you can first apply them to the B boot source, and then if you're happy with them, you can permanently apply them to the A boot source. But if there's a bug, if there's a problem with that newly applied service, you are able to reboot back from the A source, which is the version essentially of the operating system you had installed before you applied those program temporary fixes, those patches. C is a diagnostic IPL source that I don't think is particularly documented. It's meant for IBM service field personnel. And then D is the alternate source. So in this case, D means our DVD drive or our CD drive, not because the letter D means DVD. It's just the fourth letter in the alphabet. So when you're first installing, you IPL from the D IPL source. That will let you boot from the CD. And then you can do a manual IPL or a normal unattended IPL. So again, once the system's all up and running, you do a normal unattended IPL, but we're going to do a manual IPL so that you get to interact with the IPL process and choose options during startup. So we'll say OK there, save those settings. And we're just about ready to activate this partition. But one important aspect of IBM I, which we sort of touched on, is the operators console. Now, unlike what you're familiar with Linux or really any Unix or a lot of other operating systems, there is no serial port console for IBM I. Traditionally, your operators console, if you think of the mainframe world like ZOS, you'd call it your master console. Traditionally was connected, it was a 5250 terminal connected over a twin-ax connection to your AS400 server. Well, we don't have twin-ax ports, and we don't have a physical 5250 console to plug in. And so as the operating system evolved, it introduced the ability to have the operators console over the network, the LAN operations console. But again, there's no way to actually interact with the operating system until it gets far enough into its boot process that it expects to have the operations console available. And so things like setting the IP address of your LAN operations console, you have a chicken and egg problem because you can't do that without the operations console, and there's no other way to interact with the system until you have the operations console. But if you're connecting over the LAN, you might need to give your system an IP address or somehow configure it. So the way that that's been done over time has changed. The current method, which the latest, I talked about the resaves, the iBase, we're up to version R of the licensed machine code installer DVD. The latest resave is 7.3, and this is now consistent with the latest versions of 7.4 and 7.5, will actually self-assign a random IP address in the link local IP space. So link local IPs are very commonly used in IPv6, but you'll probably also recognize them in the IPv4 world if you use Windows, for example, and you don't get a DHCP address and you haven't assigned a static address. It will self-assign an address in the 169.254 class B address space. And so that's what IBM I is going to do. When it gets into the boot process and it's ready to start the console, it will self-assign its virtual console, what does it call it? Its console adapter. It's going to self-assign its console adapter interface, virtual Ethernet 1 in this case, a link local IPv4 and IPv6 address. Now, this is the one time that IPv6 is actually somewhat convenient, because if your computer has an IPv6 interface, which Linux, Windows, all the operating systems now are enabling the IPv6 stack in addition to the IPv4 stack. If I create a new Windows here and if I say IP address, you can see that each of my interfaces has a IPv6 address in addition to the IPv4 address. Usually you're not actually setting your IPv6 address. You're not getting it from a DHCP server. So the IPv6 addresses on your system are very likely the link local IPv6 addresses. That means that you already have an IPv6 address that's going to be in the same subnet as the IPv6 link local address of your auto-configured IBM I operations console. Now, you have to be plugged into the same network segment, right? The same VLAN, the same physical segment of your network to be able to communicate from one link local address to another link local address. But you'll see, I suspect we'll see that we're able to discover the iNet v6 address of our partition's operations console. But what I'm also going to do, just to be safe, in case that doesn't work, is I'm going to add another IP address, another IPv4 address to my Ethernet adapter here on my Linux system. And I'm going to give it a link local address in that 169.254 address space. So that way, if the iNet v6 stuff doesn't happen to find it, we will have an IPv4 interface that's also in the same subnet as our operations console IPv4 link local address. Again, you have to be plugged into the same VLAN or the same switch. If it's just an unmanaged switch that doesn't have VLANs, you need to be in the same physical network segment or the same broadcast domain, as we used to call it, as the console adapter of your IBM I partition, which this Linux box is. This bridge adapter is actually the real physical interface on my box, or where my real IP addresses go. So I need to become root to edit the IP addresses. Again, this is back on my Linux system here. I'm not in the VIOS. I'm doing this from my Linux system where I'm going to run the IBM I access software to get to the console of the machine. And the syntax using the new Linux IP address commands, as we go IP address, we're going to add the address 169.254, and then we can make up anything else in this class B space. I'm just going to say 1.2, and the subnet is 255.255.0.0. Like I said, it's class B space, and I'm going to add that to the device BR0. Yeah, it looks like that worked. So if I go IP address again, if we look at BR0, I'm still connected to my real network, but I also have this 169.254.1.2 address that is it's in that link local space. So I'll get out of root, and now let's go ahead and activate this partition. So remember our our LIC, licensed internal code. That IBase0 licensed internal code DVD is already in the virtual DVD drive on this partition. So I'll just say activate. We'll hit OK. And it's now starting. This is going to take a while. If you keep hitting refresh here, you'll see that we're going through the various reference codes. And if you click on that, you can see the history. You can see the description of some of them. So licensed internal code, system hardware initialization. So there's quite a few steps of just these reference codes where the system's just doing something to IPL OS 400. And it's going to be several minutes before we even get to the point where it is looking for the console. So there's no interaction with this operating system other than the reference codes that it's spitting out at this point. And that little front panel, it'll eventually get to the point where you can use the up and down buttons on that as a input device to a very primitive sort of menu system. But even then, that doesn't become available until we get far enough into the AS400 style boot process where the operating system is actually loaded enough to interact with that console. So verifying system password. This was an old thing that IBM did to lock down the resources in your machine to whatever you were licensed in terms of hardware resources. So this will just sit here for a while. I don't know what it actually does in the new converged power systems world and under VIOS, but it's just going to sit here for a while and verify the system password. And this does take a lot longer when we're loading from the alternate IPL source, our virtual CD. It still takes a while to IPL once it's installed and in regular working day-to-day mode, but it does take a lot longer this first time. So while we're waiting for it to get to the point where it's ready for us to connect the operations console, we need the 5250 both terminal emulator. So 5250 is like 3270 of the mainframe world. It's the console protocol. And in the AS400 world, they were IBM 5250 terminals as opposed to the mainframe world where they were 3270 terminals. So whenever I say 5250, that's just the console type for these IBM I systems. And there are a lot of, or not a lot of, but there are a handful of third-party 5250 emulators in addition to IBM's own PCOM and iAccess solutions. But for this stage, you also need a client that is capable of connecting and being the system console for your system. And the only one I'm aware of at this point is IBM's own iAccess solutions. It used to be a Windows application. They've now migrated that to be the new Java-based IBM iAccess client solutions. So we need to download that. So if you go ahead and search for IBM iAccess, it should usually be the first hit. Yeah, so IBM iAccess client solutions. So you can download it. You just need your IBM account. It'll make you log in when you click the link. So I'm going to go ahead and skip past the login page here. Okay, so after logging in, you get sent to marketing and registration services. That always sounds good, but yeah, we'll agree with that. And then you have some downloads available to you. The one you need is this first one, IBM iAccess Client Solutions. I really wish they actually put the current version name in the file name, but it's always called V1R1, regardless of the additional updates to the version. But that's fine. We can deal with that. So you can download that. I've already downloaded that here in my Power directory, so I have the latest download. But that's how you grab that. It'll work as your 5250 console, regardless of your IBM I licensing. But then to actually use it as an end user, the licensing for it and the number of seats you have for that on your server are controlled by server-side licensing. So that's why they just let anybody download it by signing in with your IBM account, even if you're not an IBM I customer, because the actual license enforcement for its licensed features is enforced server-side. So we can close out of all of that. We've downloaded everything we need from IBM. If we refresh, you can see that we are at destroy IPL task. DST has been started. DST are the dedicated service tools. And when you're at this code ending in 4031, this is when the system is sitting there waiting for the operations console to appear so that you can start using the dedicated service tools from the console. So that didn't take too long. We were basically able to use that time downloading iAccess, but it'll sit here for about, I think, 20 to 30 minutes before it flips to a reference code of console not found. So to make things easier, it's best to try and connect to the system while it's sitting here for that 20 or 30 minutes with this 031 code. So how do we do that? Well, we have our IBM iAccess. Let's make a directory for it. I'll just call it iAccess. And then you can unzip that zip file. And it extracts several files. They have utility programs to sort of add a start menu entry on Windows and Mac and even Linux. They have a little standalone start script to, or install script to make custom configuration files for Windows and Macs and some other platforms in Linux. But we're just going to directly run with our Java runtime the ACS bundle Java archive. So you will need a Java runtime installed. If we look at mine, I have an OpenJDK version 11 build installed. So that is perfect for running ACS. And you can just run java-jar and then this ACS bundle.jar file. And that will open it up. The first time I'm using it on this account, I think it will pop up a license agreement. Oh, I may have used it before. So here we are. Oh yeah, in fact, I have a bunch of systems already set up. So if you are first coming into this, there won't be any systems configured. And you'll be ready to select a system. And we'll just make this little window smaller because we don't really... In fact, can I turn off that sidebar? Maybe not. It doesn't really matter. So what we're going to do is we are going to go to our system configurations. And this is where if you have an IBM I system, you can add it. You can set its console address, the address you use to connect to it, various other things. But we don't know the IP address of our console yet. We have this feature that lets you locate the console. Now, it should work if you just delete find consoles near and hit search. It's going to search in the address spaces, and you can see it sort of working in the background here, of the IP addresses on your Ethernet interface. If you're on Windows and you've added that 169.254 address, I think you actually need to type 169.254.0.0 here just to give it a hint that that's the IP space you want to search. But you can see here we found it. So this is our system, and this is the IP address that it assigned itself, 169.254.62.14. So that's its link local address. And I'm actually a little bit surprised it did not find the IPv6 interface. So it's a good thing that I did add that IPv4 address to our Ethernet interface, because that looks like the address we're going to end up connecting over. So that's my system waiting for the console connection. I'm going to hit the console button here, and it's going to ask for the service tool users and password. For this stage of the installation, you can use all ones 8 times. So 111, 111. Was that 8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Nope, I'm short one. 1111 1111. And the password is the same thing. 1111 1111. Okay, and then that will establish our console connection. And it'll be another minute here, but it should, I think if we refresh the reference code, yep, so it's now in all zeros, which is basically the operating system is running. So we are now interacting with a booted copy of the operating system. We're just waiting for it to ask us the first question. I should note while we're waiting, if you search for IBM I documentation, sure, about IBM I, you're just looking for something in the IBM Docs website. It just so happens, it looks like the top hit on Google is 7.3, but you can change the IBM I version to whichever version you're actually using. If you go down and scroll to IBM I and related software, and then installing, upgrading, or deleting IBM I and related software, we are doing a installing IBM I and related software on a new system or logical partition. And I think, yeah, installing the IBM release, installing licensed code on a new logical partition, and then you can go down to installing licensed internal code on the new logical partition. So this is essentially the installation process we're following. Remember, we were on manual boot IPL source D. We're logging in as the all ones user. And the documentation here does walk through the process we're about to go through. So you don't just have to rely on this video. You can actually go to the IBM documentation, of course. There's two phases of it. There's installing licensed internal code, and then later we're going to install software on a new system. So it's all up there on the web if you need it. Okay, it's asking language feature. 2924 is English. So I'm going to leave the default of 2924 since we downloaded the English installation media. Press enter to confirm the choice. And then we're at the install licensed internal code menu. So all we have to do here is just say install licensed internal code. And again, this is the lowest level software of the IBM I operating system. So this is what's actually going to, it's going to first format the hard drive and then install. It's not a perfect analogy, but really I think of the licensed internal code as the kernel of the IBM I operating system. It's what is providing the machine interface, bytecode interpreter, and language between the higher level software, so the rest of the operating system and your application programs, and the bare metal hardware, the actual power processor and the architecture of the machine underneath it. So for various historical reasons, IBM has been calling that licensed internal code. I think that has something to do with their understanding of both copyright and patent law related to hardware microcode versus operating system software. And I think they're trying to prevent various attempts to clone or emulate aspects of OS 400 and the AS 400 platform and what's now called IBM I. Don't quote me on that. I think that's part of it. But it's just a funny IBM thing. And yeah, when you're dealing with OS 400, there's a layer of your operating system that's called the licensed internal code, which is 100% just operating system software. It's not firmware. It's not loading new microcode onto the CPU. It's just IBM playing legal games with their names for their own lawyers' purposes. All right, select load source device. So this is actually asking us what we want our future load source device to be. That is, what load source device are we installing the operating system on, or the licensed internal code on? And as we'd expect, because we just gave that one RAID logical volume as the volume that we're passing through to this partition, we see one option here. So I'll just enter a 1 to select that device. I've chosen the following device. Press F10 to confirm your choice. I'll press F10. Okay, now we have a slightly more comprehensive install licensed internal code menu. We are going to be installing onto this disk. And in this case, we are going to install licensed internal code and initialize the system. This is a new install. We're not restoring from a tape backup. We're not doing anything funny with existing configurations or upgrades. We're just installing and initializing a new system. So we'll enter 2 and hit enter. Clear out that selection. It tells us that all data on the system will be destroyed. That's what we want. I'm going to hit F10 to continue the installation. I really like this font that IBM has embedded in iAccess. I think I've seen this similar font in PCOM maybe, but this isn't one of my system fonts. They actually are just using their own font that they've built into their client software here. So I love the green color that they've chosen. I like the font. I really associate this look with my IBM I installations, and I like it. So now the load source disk is being initialized. I think it's basically formatting the disk. So we have, what was it? Something like 350 gigabytes in this volume. This is going to take a while. There's no progress bar. It just tells you how long it's already been in half-minute increments. So you just have to sit and wait. Figure it will take at least an hour. When I've done this using fiber channel storage backed by a ZFS ZVol on a Solaris or FreeBSD server acting as a fiber channel target, this actually goes very quickly. I think that ZFS and those ZVols and their copy on write semantics very quickly realize that what's being done here is basically just zeroing out the disk. And so they're able to do that extremely quickly. But with the local physical disks, I think even though the disks are already zeroed because we did that format and we created a new RAID array, I don't think IBM I knows that. It's just sitting here and it is just writing zeros to every byte of the entire disk. And it does that slowly. So we will jump ahead to the future when this is just about done. I'll see you then. All right, so that was nearly an hour. Actually came in just under an hour. And it has finished preparing the disk. So now it will move on to actually installing the licensed internal code on that disk that it just prepared. And after it goes through this process, it will automatically re-IPL the system from the hard drive instead of the CD. And actually, if we open up back on our system configurations, the control panel, we had opened the console to get this console, but the control panel is, again, another virtual version of that little pop-out panel in the front of the physical machine that I showed you in part 1 of the video series. You can do some of the things they're able to do with the little up and down arrows on that console to select various options when you need to interact with the operating system using just those buttons on the front of the machine. But anyway, you'll see that our current IPL type is D, which is loading from the CD drive. At some point when the installer here is ready to re-IPL from the load source device or the hard drive that we are installing onto, you'll see that it will change to IPL type A, which is the permanent applied service side of the hard drive. The other thing to keep in mind is, again, right now we're connected to the console of this machine using its temporary just self-assigned link local IP address. When it re-IPLs, it will get back to the point where it actually just randomly assigns itself a new address. But because we will be booting from the hard drive at that point, we'll actually be able to go in and change the console settings to assign it the IP address that we want it to use long-term. And because we're IPL'd off the hard drive, that change will actually persist. If we were to have done that with the dedicated service tools off of the CD, it wouldn't actually save it anywhere because we're basically just running out of an image loaded into RAM from the CD. Okay, so it looks like it's 100% done with whatever it's trying to do here. Again, once it spent that hour formatting the hard drive, actually installing, copying the licensed internal code from this one DVD, looks like it goes pretty quickly. Okay, you can see here the connection ended. We just got disconnected from the console. I'm going to close this because, again, it's going to come back at a different IP address. And it's like it won't actually flip the IPL mode until the re-IPL, so we're not going to see it on this connection. But when we reconnect, I expect that we'll be able to confirm that we booted off of the hard drive that we just installed the licensed internal code to. So I'll close that. Let's keep this console locator window open here. If I go back to IBM, where, let's see, since we're here, we are at approximately this stage of the installation here. So it just re-IPL'd after installing licensed code. If we go back to IBM, we may have been logged out. Yep, so log back in. You can see once again, it is re-IPLing and it is showing a reference code of 4031. So we're already back at the point in the IPL process where it's looking for the console. So we'll go back to our iAccess client solutions and we will hit search again and we will hopefully find the new address that our system assigned itself. And there it is. It's now 62.8. The 62.14 was left over from before. So that looks good. I'll go ahead and connect to the console on the new IP address. This time we're going to use the Service Tools user QSecOFR. This is the security officer login. Now, these logins to the service tools, while they use the same name like QSecOFR, it's actually a different login, different password than to the operating system. We'll see that later. But the password here is all capitals QSecOFR. And it's basically using a self-signed certificate. So we just say, yes, we'll accept that. Tells us QSecOFR password has expired. So QSecOFR. And we'll just give it a new password. Right now, the password level in the service tools is set to, I think, just like a default basic level. So your password has to be 10 characters or less. We'll be able to turn that up. But for now, I'm just going to set a simple single word password. Okay, so our connection's active again. And if I go back here and pop out the control panel, yeah, now that we're reconnected, we can see that we IPL'd from the A side. So we are now running from the hard drive in our machine, in our partition. If I make this, bigger, it'll increase the font size. Yep, so that's about as big as it goes. They don't have a font that scales up larger, unfortunately, but this fills most of our screen. Okay, so we're still just waiting for things to happen. You can actually watch those reference codes scroll by here. And if you mouse over them, it looks like it actually will give you a description. So we're back at a verifying system password reference code here, like we saw when we were first IPLing from the installation DVD. Okay, so the first thing we see is a disk configuration attention report. This is going to draw our attention to any problems in the disk configuration. In this case, it's not a problem. It's just letting us know that there is a new disk configuration. You can actually hit 5 to display a detailed report. So I think this is just telling you, if this is a surprise to you, if you thought you were actually booting up off of a disk that had data and had been used before, this may be a problem. But you can just accept that, and we will now move on to this boot menu, which is to IPL or install the operating system. Well, we don't have the operating system installed yet, so IPLing won't really do us much good. Eventually, we will want to install the operating system, but at this point, we want to use dedicated service tools. This is sort of a I don't know how to describe it. Again, I guess if we called that licensed internal code the kernel of the IBM I operating system, the dedicated service tools are some kernel configuration tools. And they are independent of actually having booted the operating system. They're things we can do without having gone into the full operating system. So we're going to use dedicated service tools. And what we're going to do here is set up our console interface, the operations console interface. So service tools user, again, qsec OFR, and the password that we just changed it to. And by doing that, we have enabled a couple extra options on the menu here. I'm going to select DST console mode. So that's option number 6. Oh, that's actually not what I wanted. I'm going to F12 here. We want to work with DST environment, number 5. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to choose system devices, and then I'm going to choose to configure, actually first let's do select console. And this is a very important setting to do before we lose our connection to the console, which is to say allow console recovery and console can be taken over by another console. Change that to yes. Whoops, that's not the field we were in. So change this first field to 1 for yes. And then the console type is an operations console over the LAN. So you can see we're currently using option number 3. Make sure we leave that as option number 3. We're not hooked up to a hardware management console. We don't have a twin axial interface on our system, and we don't have a direct way to plug in an operations console. So we will always be using LAN console. And if we lose the console connection, we want to just be able to reconnect this console program, this IBM I Access console, and become the new console, take over the console. So set that to 1 and save that. And this will tell us that this is the communications adapter. That's fine. We'll just hit enter. Okay, so that has enabled the console takeover functionality. Now we're going to configure the Service Tools LAN adapter. Remember, right now, every time the system starts up, it's just going to assign itself a new random link local address. We want this thing on a predictable IP address that we can connect to without having to be in the same subnet, without having to add that link local address to our interface. So we can give it a host name. I usually just call it whatever the machine name is. We called this machine OS400, and then I add SP for service processor, or ST for service tools, whatever you like. IP address. Let's give this 192.168.42. Thinking out loud here, we used 42 for our physical machine service processor. We used 43 for the VIOS. We used 44 for the Linux installation that we did in the previous video. So we're up to 45 should be the next address that I haven't used in my network here. Gateway 192.168.42.1. The subnet mask is correct. So I'm going to go ahead and store this. F7 will store it to the system's configuration. And I'm going to activate this configuration. So F14, you can hit Shift F2 to get F14. So the normal function keys F1 through F12 on your keyboard, and then it circles back where F13 would be Shift F1, F14 would be Shift F2, so on and so forth, all the way up to Shift F12 to get F24. So let's hit Shift F2, and that, I think, activated the LAN adapter on that IP address, maybe. So let's hit F3 here, and I wonder if we go back and ping 192.168.42.1 45, was it? It responds to pings now. That's a good sign. So let's find where our window went here. And I'm going to close this console window. And this is why we set it up such that we can take over the console by reconnecting. And just to test this all out, let's close this search window. We'll add a new system configuration. So eventually this is going to be OS 400, just the name of the machine that we gave it. And the connection, we don't need to worry about yet because the operating system isn't actually installed. But the service host name of the LAN console and virtual control panel, we should now be able to connect to that at 192.168.42.45. So if I hit OK, we now have this OS 400 system. I'll close this window. We choose OS 400. You can see a couple temporary entries that it used to connect to those temporary link local addresses. But this should now be a saved configuration. And if we connect to 5250 console, it'll ask for our user, which will use that security officer, qsec_ofr, and the password we set. And there we are. So we are now able to connect with our known, predictable, stable IP address, which is what we will now use for the rest of this partition's life to connect to it. Okay, and we picked up right where we left off. We're on that work with system devices page, which was where we were when we closed the console to that link local IP address. So that's all we need to do here. We have configured our Service Tools LAN adapter, and we have enabled console takeover. Both very, very important steps to do at this point. And again, looking at the IBM documentation, they will also tell you that after that disk report, this is the point to configure your console. And it walks you through how we got to that menu. Work with DST environment, system devices, console mode, and to make sure that we can do console takeover. So at this point, we can exit out of that menu, and now we're ready to install the operating system. So the operating system itself, as opposed to the underpinnings of the operating system that we already installed, is on that B Group 1 set of DVDs. So we need to change the DVD that's in our virtual CD-ROM drive so that we can install the operating system from that first B Group DVD. You can do that through the IVM. You can do it either through the virtual storage or go in and edit the partition and pop up the window to choose and change it and hit save. But as we're going to be doing this relatively frequently throughout the rest of the installation process, I prefer to do it from the VIOS shell. So I'm still SSH'd into VIOS. And if we do lsrep, you can see that our i7.3 base image is still in our VT-opt1 optical drive. So VT-opt1 is the virtual optical drive in our IBM I OS 400 partition. So I want to put the DVD i7.3 group 1-01 in that drive. And there's a command to do that. You say load opt -F to force, so it'll take the old CD out or the old DVD out and put the new one in. And you give it the virtual device that you want to operate on. So VT-opt1 in this case. And then you say -disk, and you give it the name of the new disk that you want to put in the drive. So the first disk of that IBM i7.3 Group 1 DVD set. I'll hit enter. And now if we do an lsrep, you'll see that this disk is in VT-opt1. The disk i7.3 base is no longer in any optical drives. So as we cycle through them, it'll be easy to just copy and paste this command up to the last digit here, and then we can change to disk 2, disk 3, so on and so forth. So back in our console, let's go ahead and install the operating system. It'll ask where we are installing the operating system from. We're installing it from an optical device, our DVD drive. And it's asking us to confirm. We'll hit enter to confirm our choice to install the operating system. It once again confirms the language code. 2924, the default is English, and matches what we've already been installing and matches the media set that we have. Enter to confirm. And it will now actually IPL the operating system. So this is the normal IPL screen of IBM I. It goes through a number of steps to recover any journals. So if the system wasn't shut down cleanly, this is where it sets up the database, does any journal recovery. A lot of the PTF, program temporary fixes, the updates to the operating system will end up being applied here when you reboot after installing them. And then it will finally start the operating system. Okay, so we have some options here. We want to take the defaults. We can set the date. At this point, I believe the system clock is operating in UTC. So it is, in fact, the 26th of February, 2023 at 08:22, and we'll say it's 45 when we hit enter UTC. So now it will install really the base operating system, the really minimal core set of files you need to be able to IPL and log in to IBM I. So this will take a little while, but everything it needs right now is just on that first DVD. So we can just sit back and watch this go through the installation stages. Okay, so at this point, we get a sign-on screen. We log in as the QSec OFR, and the security officer user. No password at this point. We're now dealing with operating system users, so this is actually a different security officer account than for the console service tools. It's neither here nor there for the moment because there's no password, but we'll see in a minute that it eventually will have a password that we set independently from the service tools user. So for the IPL options, so it looks like we're actually going to fully finish loading the now freshly installed base operating system. We'll provide the date in month, day, year format. So that's going to be 02/26/23. It's currently about midnight. I'm never quite sure at this point if, even though we're going to give it the time zone, if we still are in UTC or not. And my memory is failing me, but I think we're still going to provide the UTC time here, which is 08:35. We'll say maybe it's 55 by the time we hit enter. You can choose your time zone. You can hit F4 for the list of time zones once you're in that field. I'm going to find my Pacific time. Looks like there are a few different options here. You see F11 will show the DST name. So this one switches from PST to PDT. F11 will now cycle to display the alternate name. And okay, so at least now we can see that of the 4 Pacific times, 3 of them are the America Los Angeles sort of Unix time zone file name. 1 is Tijuana. So I'm not sure what the difference between PST and PST2 are, but I suspect PST is the correct one for me. So you put a 1 in the column that you want to select, you hit enter, that will populate this field for you with the correct time zone name. For this initial IPL, we want to say yes to start system to restricted state. We want to say yes to set major system options, and we want to say yes to define or change system at IPL. Let me double check the time. It's now almost 37, let's say 50, and I will hit enter right when it hits 50 seconds. There we go. So set major system options, we're going to use normal mode, not backward compatibility with the old S36, which was the predecessor to even the AS400s in the mid 80s. And again, no special environment. We're not setting up our system to emulate even older pre-AS400 systems. So we'll just hit enter there. And then now define or change the system IPL. So this is where we are able to change any system values. And system values are sort of the lowest level of configuration for IBM I. So let's go into system value commands, and we can say work with system values. And that will pop up the work with system values page. And you can scroll through here with page up, page down, and see what all of these system values are. So these, I assume, have just grown over time as they've needed them. So there's quite a bit here. Some of them have to do with the current date and time. This is how you could go back in and change the time. There's some various security options for the system. So there's a few here that I like to change at this point before we install the rest of the system. One that I change is the Q create default authority. Q create authority. So this is the default security for public access on newly created objects. So if I display that, you can see the default is change. That means that any new object I make in the operating system, the public authority, so all users, have change authority. That doesn't really make sense to me. I would think that you would create them with no access, and then you would explicitly grant access to the users or the groups or even public that you need. So I'm going to change that system value by entering 2 next to it to star exclude. And down here, it'll say system value Q create changed from change to exclude. Now, if you've not used IBM I OS 400 a lot, you'll see a lot of things that start with the letter Q. Basically, everything that comes from IBM that's part of the operating system, they name with the first letter of Q. So most of the libraries that ship with the system that you'll see once we're logged in start with the letter Q, if they're the default libraries, if they're system-provided libraries. And then everything else you create, you may typically create without a Q at the front. So it's easy to distinguish IBM provided stuff and your own stuff. The other thing you'll see is a lot of names that start with an asterisk. And those are basically to indicate that this is a symbolic name for something versus a literal string. So for example, when we changed that default public authority, the word star exclude is a symbol that actually means something to the operating system. It's a particular access authority that you're able to grant by default to public. That sort of distinguishes it from if we were trying to use just the literal string exclude. So if it's a symbolic value that has meaning to the operating system, and you'll see this in most parameters to a lot of commands, for example, you'll see a lot of things that start with an asterisk. And so that's just the convention for those symbolic values for parameters. Okay, so we changed that. There's a system parameter here called password level, QPWD level. We don't have to change this now, but it doesn't take effect until the next re-IPL. So I want to change it now, and we're going to change this up to password level 3, which if you look at the descriptions here, this is essentially the highest level of password security. It allows long passwords, and it's encrypted or hashed in such a way that it will break backward compatibility with really old Windows clients. So the old Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows ME clients, because it uses a password hashing algorithm that's no longer supported in the way those really old NetBIOS clients worked. But I'll do 3 now because eventually we want to be able to use long passwords. And similarly, if we do Q password maximum length, I don't know why you would ever restrict that, but we'll change that. And unfortunately, we can't just jump right to 128 because remember I said that that password level value doesn't take effect until the system re-IPLs again. So we can just set it up to the maximum of 10 right now, which will let us set 10 character long passwords. After the next re-IPL, the password level will take effect. We'll be able to come back in here and change that maximum length all the way up to 128. And then there's one setting that the documentation recommends you change at this point, scan file systems control. So if I display this, you can see that right now the scan options are asterisk none, but I want to change it to asterisk no post RST, so no post restore. And this is recommended by the documentation here. So if you're following along with the IBM I installation guide, we are at, let's see, where are we? Let's go to, yep, we're ready to install the operating system. So that's the phase we're in. And this is where it walks through everything I've just shown you in terms of choosing the system values, setting the time. We saw that screen. This is where it tells you to start to a restricted state. And yeah, so here's where it recommends that you can consider setting qscan fs control to no post restore. So we'll do that. Okay, it's been changed. Back out of that screen. And that is probably good for now. Once we have installed everything, we're going to want to change more. But at this point, those are just those initial options I like to set so that we can set ourselves up for success. So I will F3 out of that, and then we can hit F3 again. And I think, yeah, we hit F3 one more time. That will exit and continue the IPL. Okay, and it'll finish up completing the installation. All right, we're back at the sign-on screen. So once again, we'll sign in as the security officer with that QSECOFR username. And now the password field is available. So like with the service tools, the default password is QSECOFR, all capitals. And pretty much all default users on the operating system, their initial password is just set to their username in all capital letters. So telling us we must change our password. So we enter that old password, new password. Again, at this point, we're still limited to 10 characters. So I'll just use the same short password I used for the service tools. I'll hit enter. And in just a moment, we're logged in. So the first thing it's having us do is accept any unaccepted license agreements, software license agreements for components that have been installed, which is the machine code, that licensed internal code, and then the base operating system for IBM I v7-r3m0. So put a 5 next to both of these to display the agreement, hit enter. And you can do F15, which is Shift F3. Remember, you're adding 12 to everything to get the next 12, F13 through F24. So I'll do Shift F3 and hit Enter to confirm that you're accepting all the license agreements in this component. And now to move on and show us the next license agreement, we'll hit Shift F3 again to hit F15 to accept all the agreements here. Hit Enter. And you can see now the accept status is yes. So we can go ahead and exit with F3, the work with software agreements screen. And now we're at the main menu of IBM I. So we are logged into our operating system that is running off of our hard drive. However, you may note that there were 4 more DVDs that we didn't install anything from. So this is indeed a very, very minimal core, just enough to be able to boot and log in installations so far of the operating system. It's missing pretty critical core components to actually start doing anything. It has no network servers or services. It doesn't have the Unix portable application, what's it called? Something environment, anything like that. So the next step is to actually go ahead and install the rest of the software. So to do that, we are going to get the system into a restricted state. It should already be in restricted state because we chose that IPL option to boot into a restricted state. But just to be safe, we'll do it anyway. So following the steps from the installation guide, we're going to change the QSys operator message queue We're going to tell it that we want it to break when there's a message, which means it will actually take over our screen and display the message on severities of 60 or higher. We'll hit enter there. And we're now getting a message that was already in the queue saying console did not vary on. That's fine. That was just part of that initial installation and console connection process. And we will now bring the system down to a restricted state, which again should already be the case, but you use the end subsystem command for that. We're going to end all subsystems. So star all is one of those symbolic parameter names for that command. And then star IMMED for immediate instead of giving anything a grace period to end. So in subsystem all immediate. And once all subsystems are ended, the system will be what's in the restricted condition. Think of this almost as single user mode in the Unix world. All right, so we got the messages confirming that we're in the restricted condition. You can now change that message queue again and change MSG queue. We're going to change the queue sys operator message queue, and we're just going to bump the severity up to 95. It's important to make sure that we had previously turned break message delivery on and that we are at severity 95 or lower. We'd see more messages, but severity 95 so that we actually get the prompts to swap DVDs when we are installing from a multi-DVD set. Oh, and we just got a message out of the blue here telling us that our IBM grace period expires in 71 days on May 7th, 2023. So you get 71 days to try out the operating system, and most of the licensed programs that IBM includes in the operating system also come with a 71-day grace period before you need to actually enter your license keys and get your licensing all sorted out. When this number hits 0 for the IBM I license, you will not be able to log into your machine anymore. The only thing you'll be able to do basically is enter a license key. So again, just hit enter to clear those messages, and then we'll hit enter to run our change message queue command. Perfect. So now we'll go license program. So LIC PGM, go takes you to another named menu. So like this is the main menu. There's a whole licensed programs menu. And on the work with licensed program screens, this is where it gives us the option to install all of the programs from a set of installation media. There are steps we can do to prepare for the install to make it go more smoothly. You can see what is installed. In fact, I'm curious right now if we say number 10. Yeah, so we only have 3 licensed programs installed. We have back level revisions of the QGPL, which is the general purpose library, and the Q user sys library. And then we have a compatible version of IBM I installed. So typically you would see several pages of the installed programs here. If you look at number 11, install licensed programs, this actually gives you a list of all of the licensed programs that IBM I itself knows about that might be out there, even if you haven't installed them. So one way to go about doing this is to just go through and put a 1 next to the program options that you want to install. So if you don't need the System36 environment, you don't have to install it. You can just go on to the example tools library. You'd want to install online information. You want to install the host servers. These are kind of the core OS 400 services. System openness includes, these are the header files, the .h files for programming, particularly in the Unix-like environment. There's various, the symmetric multiprocessing, so you can use multiple processors for DB2. Integrated servers, again, these are various other system services that you'd want for network services. You can install a DNS server. PASE, Portable App Solutions Environment, that's what the S means. So this is the AIX compatible Unix-like environment inside IBM I. you would typically need to install that, because a lot of IBM I core services actually are just ports of Unix tools these days. So you get the idea. You can go through and individually select the stuff you want to install. Now, one problem is everything that you might want to install isn't in this list. You can see some of the compilers down here. So for example, if you went through and just selected a few things to install, you wouldn't get the SSH server, for example, because it's not in this list. You would have to know the 7-character program number and then product option for the OpenSSH server, which if you Google and if you look enough through the right documentation, it'll be documented somewhere, and you just plug that number in and you put a 1 next to it, and then it'll install that in addition to the other things you've selected. But because I am setting this up as a server to, probably learn about OS 400 or IBM I, play with a bunch of options, I would probably be installing most of the languages and most of these options anyway. So what I like to do, and for the people who think I'm crazy, this is actually somewhat recommended by IBM when you get down to the point where installing, let's see, we want to go down to, we're now in the installing software on a new system with IBM I installed, because we've now installed the base operating system there. Installing additional licensed programs. So again, here's where it says in subsystem all, make sure that you're at break with the right severity. And they recommend, if you want to install all licensed programs, use manual install all. This will save time. Even if you want most of the licensed programs on the media, the manual install option 1, install all, is the preferred choice. And then you can just delete any programs that you don't want. We have plenty of hard drive space, so we don't need to bother deleting them. So we're just going to go with the recommendation, this note here, where we install all of them. There is another thing we can do to speed this up, which is to pre-accept all of the license agreements. If you're installing all the components and you don't do this, your installation process is going to be a little bit frustrating, because your process of swapping the CDs and everything is just going to be randomly interrupted over the next, half an hour, 45 minutes, and you just have to be there accepting license agreements. So it ends up being much quicker and much nicer to just pre-accept all the license agreements of everything that's on all of these DVDs. So to do that, you go to prepare for install, number 5. And we're going to work with software agreements. So I'll put a 1 there to select that. And it says there's no licensed programs that need their software agreements accepted. Remember, we already accepted those 2 when we first started the system up. But something we can do is restore software agreements. So this is going to load software agreements from installation media. So I'm going to hit F22, which is Shift F10. And it asks, where do I want to restore agreements from? And we are going to restore them from opt01. That's the device name of our optical drive. And I'll just hit enter. And it's going to read the DVD that we currently have in our optical drive. So group 101, to pick up any extra software agreements for software on that disk that wasn't installed with the base system. All right, and now it's saying I've read everything from that disk. Load the next volume that you want to restore software agreements from in the optical device. And it lets us know that we can reply with an X or a G. So X means exit. We're all done reading all of the disks that we want to read from. G means go, which is it will continue and read the next volume. So we're going to go back to our VIOS shell session here. And we're just going to load the next disk in the group. So I'll copy my load opt command, and then I'll just do number 2 to load that next disk image that I have in my media library. So now we can go back to our console, enter G, and hit enter. And you can see when it has this X system down here, this is the 5250 emulator waiting for the system to do something and respond. So that's a key or an indicator that the system is thinking, because this panel looks like it's just asking you for input again. But really, we gave it the input, and we're just waiting for a response from the system. Okay, it read that next disk. We'll do the same thing for disk 3. And we hit G for go. Again, it's not asking for more input here. We're just waiting for the system to process. All right, same thing for disk 4. And G for go. And finally, disk 5. And just asking for the next volume. We are all out of disks, so we are going to say X to let it know that we are done feeding it disks that we want to restore license agreements from. And now we'll get a list of all of these software agreements that have not yet been accepted. You can see more, so we can page down. It looks like it's about 4 pages of them. So what we can do is just put a 5 next to each one of them to display each license agreement. And you can page down and keep typing 5, and it will remember that you entered the 5s on the previous page. So if I page back up, you can see we still have all of our line selections there. So just keep entering 5 and then page down until you are at the end of the list and hit enter. Now it's going to display them one by one. So on each of these, I'm just going to hit Shift F3 or F15 and hit enter. F15, enter, F15, enter, F15, enter. I'm just going to keep doing that until we're back at the list of all software agreements. Okay. So that's it. So now we're back at the list. If we page down through all of it, you can see accept status is yes on all of them. So I'll hit F3 to exit out of that menu, and I'll hit F3 to exit out of the prepare for install menu. So now the only thing we need to do during the installation is just change the DVD out when it finishes reading it. And then after it loads and stages all of the data from all 5 DVDs, we can just sit back, go off, make dinner, do something else while it actually processes all of the software and installs it all, whereas it would get sort of hung up and pause on asking about all the license agreements if we hadn't pre-accepted all of them. Okay, so let's load disk 1 back in our optical drive. So back to 1. And let's choose that install all option. So I'm going to choose number 1. And we want to install all products, number 2. And the installation device, again, is opt01. We don't need to replace if current. So again, if there's a product on the CD that's already installed, we're not going to replace it. Non-accepted agreements, there shouldn't be any. You can choose to either have it skip over that program or display the agreement. So just in case, we'll say display the agreement so that we don't miss out on installing any software. And then automatic IPL, if you want to re-IPL after installing everything, no, we do not. So we'll leave that at N for no. Now, if I hit enter, it's going to start reading the optical disc, and it's just going to install every installation package on every disk that I feed it. So it is staging them into a temporary area. So you'll see that, okay, it already finished reading disk 1 because there's actually not much more that hasn't been installed on disk 1 already. So we will load disk 2 into the drive. And once again, like we saw reading these software agreements, there's X and G. So we're going to go, and we're just going to keep feeding it disks and telling it to go until we have no more disks to give it, at which point we'll say X. And right now it's largely staging these into, I think, temporary areas. So even though we'll only see it say, 1 license program process, 2 license program process, we're going to get well ahead of it in terms of the DVDs so that it can read in all of the data and stage the files in a temporary area. And then once we're done feeding it DVDs, it will still be several minutes longer, where it's actually going through all of those temporary files it loaded and permanently installing them into the system libraries. Okay, next volume. So we will give it number 3. And number 4. And our final disk for now, disk 5. All right, it's asking for the next volume, but we've already made it all the way through disk 5. So we hit X there to tell it we are done feeding it disks. And now that we've told it we're done, it actually knows exactly how many products it's installing from that media that we gave it. So everything now is staged somewhere, and it is just going to run through and install all of those. So sit back and enjoy the show of watching your computer count from 4 up to 103. And it will actually start going faster, I think, now that it's not competing for disk resources and processing, copying all of the installation files off of the DVDs into its temporary staging area. It will actually pick up the pace and start running through the individual programs it's installing reasonably quickly. All right, it looks like it finished. So the first, what was that, 20 or so in the counter of licensed programs to install took a long time, and it made you worry that this process was going to take forever to get up to all 100 or so. But then after it got through those initial, I guess, beefy ones, it did the next 80 or so just very quickly, just a couple of minutes to do all of them. So we did sit here for a little while. You can keep an eye on the clock here, but that wasn't too bad, all things considered. Now it tells us work with licensed programs function not complete. That's fine if you if you display installed licensed programs. So number 10, you can see that we now have compatible versions, no longer the backrev version of QGPL and Qusersys. And all of these other things we installed. If you page down, you'll see that advanced DBCS printer support and advanced DBCS printer support IPDS are showing as an error here. When I do the install everything from the DVDs method in this version of IBM I, as well as IBM I V7R4 on my Power 8 system, I always get this error installing this set of packages. So I just ignore it. I don't think it's particularly a real problem. But this is the point where if I hit F3, you can go to delete licensed programs and remove anything that you don't want. So like the documentation said, it's quicker just to install everything if you're going to keep a good portion of it, and then delete the things that you really don't want installed on your system. In this case, I'll keep everything except I'll just delete these 2 components that are in error, so they're not just always sitting there showing an error on my system. Hit enter again to confirm, and it deleted those very quickly, since I suspect they weren't actually installed in the first place. The other thing to note, if we go to display licensed programs, is if I scroll down and I'm looking for the OpenSSH. Here it is. So like OpenSSH, OpenSSL, and zlib. This wasn't listed in the screen where you could select the components to install. You would have had to have manually entered 5733 SC1 and then the appropriate component of that. In fact, there's 2 lines here. So if you do F11 and then F11 again, you would have had to have known to enter 5733 SC1 star base and 5733 SC1 as programs you wanted to install. And there's no easy way to list installable programs from installation media that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean that there isn't a way, but I haven't found a quick way just to see what might be on a CD without actually having to go to the documentation and look for all of the individual program numbers and product options that are documented to be on a particular disk, which is out there in the IBMI documentation. So again, that's just one of the nice things of just saying install all of the software on all of the disks I'm about to give you, is that you can pick up things that you may not even know about that are on that disk otherwise. So I'll hit enter, and that's it. We can hit F3 to get back to the main menu. The next thing we're going to do here is just re-IPL and have the system come up in a regular unattended startup in a normal operating state. So it'll start all of its services. But looking at the clock, it's now 1:30 a.m. And when we first pushed the button in IVM to power on this partition for the first time to boot off of that first licensed internal code installer, it was 22:47. So that'll give you an idea of about how much time to set aside to install if you're in a similar sort of scenario as I am on a Power 7 with local SAS disks through the local IBM SAS RAID controller. You're looking at, what was that? Just a little under 3 hours. So keep that in mind. Set aside a morning or an afternoon when you are hoping to install IBMI on your Power server. Now, let's do one thing before we re-IPL. If you go back to that, in fact, we closed that little virtual control panel. So we will pop open the virtual control panel for this machine. You can see here that we're still set to manual IPL mode from the A IPL type. We want to pick the option to set IPL side to B. Now that we've installed the operating system on the permanent A side and everything's been applied, you almost always operate by using the B IPL side. That's your normal day-to-day IPL type. And we can also then change from manual IPL mode to normal IPL mode. Note that as soon as you're in normal mode, this is like on the old physical machines, there was a key switch to go from normal to manual. When you're in normal mode, you've turned that key to the normal locked position. It disables your ability to change anything else here on the control panel, like setting the IPL side back to A or back to D. So if you ever do need to use those options, you just change to manual, you do whatever control panel or DST functions you need to do, and then you change back to normal mode. So in normal mode, the system won't sit there with that, what was it, 4031 reference code during IPL waiting for the console. Because in normal mode, it's an unattended startup. It's not waiting for you to answer questions about how you want to IPL the system. So it doesn't have to wait for the operator's console to be available, which is nice because then we can just power on the machine by activating the partition and it will fully IPL itself into the state where it's up and running and all the default services are started and it'll start handling user requests, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so B normal, that's all good. Back here, we'll now use the power down system command. So PWR-DWN-SYS. And we will use the prompt function of IBMI. So we'll hit F4, and that will present us with the parameters to that command. We can just do an immediate shutdown. So star IMMED, and we don't need to give a time for immediate. And we will say yes to re-IPL, and then you can just leave the other things at the default. The IPL source, A, B, D, you can override here, but we will just use the panel, which is whatever you've actually set on the control panel. So you hit enter, and you hit F16 to confirm power down. So I'll do Shift F4 to get my F16 key. And you can see, because we just did an immediate power down, my console connection has already ended. But because we have set the IP address for our console, it's not just going to randomly change every time we re-IPL. As soon as the console service comes back available, the emulator should reconnect automatically. And it already says emulator connected, so now I think it's just waiting for, it's going to pop back and forth between, yeah, waiting for emulator and maybe disconnected and maybe reconnected. But eventually you'll see the automated, unattended IPL console screen come up here. Okay, it's been several minutes, but you can see now, connection active. So we're actually back here at the sign-on screen on the console. So let's log in as qsec-offer and whatever password we set. And at this point, everything is fully installed. There's really nothing left to do that would be considered part of the installation. So I'm not going to get too much into what you can do with IBM I once it's installed. Again, these videos are more focused on, I got my server, what do I do with it? How do I get things installed? Well, we're here, it's installed. However, there are probably a couple of things that I would consider just part of still the base installation, and that is set a few more of those system values now that the system's installed, and then we'll also get this machine on the network. Because remember, this 42.45 address, this is just the operator console interface and the dedicated service tools IP address and Ethernet interface, essentially. The actual operating system is not on the network at all. We've not configured its internet or its network interface. So I will also point out that in the IBM documentation, after you get through all of this, they do have a handy checklist somewhere down at the bottom here. Yeah, so all the way down at the bottom, they link to the checklist, completing the IBM I installation. And this just goes through, things like changing default passwords for the service tools user IDs, so you can remove the installation media now, any extra special instructions, if you're able to get the latest cumulative PTF packages, you can install all of the operating system updates, various other things. And eventually they will also, here they'll tell you how to add license key information to add your license keys, all sorts of stuff. They do remind you that if you, let's see, where does it say here? They recommend the TCP/IP setup. We're going to go through that in a minute. Well, I don't need to find it right now. Oh yeah, here it is. They remind you if you did change that scan control system value to no post restore as they recommended in the installation guide, you can undo that setting. You can just change it back to your preferred setting, which the default was none. So we'll go through and do all of that. But that's a helpful checklist of just tasks to go through and see if they apply to you and things to do to finish your installation. So you have some messages waiting. If we work with messages, WRK-MSG, you're seeing your user messages, Q Security Officer. So it looks like there's just a job that ran successfully there automatically for us. I'm sure that's fine. We can remove that. But if you hit F6, you'll see the system operator message queue. And you'll see a lot more here because this is where the operating system is actually logging a bunch of messages during its startup process. And you're also seeing a lot of warnings here about the fact that we're using various features of the operating system that we have 0 users licensed for, and our grace period, so that demo period without providing any kind of license keys, is going to expire in 71 days. You can just page down through all of this to see the sorts of things that happen during the system initialization, but that's all fine. We also have a couple of messages needing a reply. Do you want to send data to IBM by activating the PM agent? No, thank you. I'll go ahead and hit 5 there to reply. And it tells you the possible choices for replying are I, G, or C. Basically ignore, and the next time essentially the system restarts, the message will come back. Go says, yep, go ahead and do the activation. I think this is probably the preventative maintenance agent. Or cancel, don't activate the agent, and don't ask me again. I think that's the choice I'll choose, so I'll just cancel that. C, there we go. Yep, enter. And then this is just an informational message that electronic service agent has not been activated. If I display that, my only possible choice here is to enter ignore, but it's telling me to set that up. I can use the go service command to go to the menu that will let me do that. So I'll just do I for ignore. Reply message sent. You can hit enter again to clear that. If you just want to clear all the messages out now that don't have a pending reply, you can do F16. So that will get me a nice, clean system operator message log. And I'll just hit F3 to exit back out to the menu. Okay, so as I mentioned, let's go ahead and finish setting up system values. So let's work sysval. That's the work with system values command here. And the first thing we'll do before we forget that Q scan, whatever it was called, Q scan file system control. If we change that, we'll put it back to the default that was there before, which was asterisk none. Okay, so it says that's changed. I can hit F3. And I want to set the maximum password length. So Q pwd max length. Remember, we had to wait for a re-IPL before our higher security password level applied. So now that we have re-IPL'd and that has applied, I can change that and allow all the way up to 128 character passwords, which again, there's no reason you should really ever restrict password length, let people use long passphrases. There's a setting in here called Q limit security officer. So we're logged in as the security officer. It's both a user, QSec OFR. It's also a basically an account permission, the sec officer role. This is kind of the equivalent of a root user on a Unix system. This user can do everything. And by default, if we display this limit security officer device access, it says that the security officer can only log into devices that are explicitly granted permission for security officer to log in. So once we get this thing on the network, you won't just be able to use the regular 5250 emulator and log in as the security officer. Right now, the security officer can only log on to the system console. In a real secure environment, you probably would want that to be the case, and you would perhaps grant just specific remote terminal sessions that the security officer can log on to. In our case, I'm going to change that to a 0, which says we don't need explicit device access permissions. So basically, I can connect to the box and connect as the security officer, which, again, for my purposes, is more convenient. There's a setting called QCTL SBSD, the controlling subsystem. This defaults to QBase, which is a subsystem defined in the QSys library. For normal production, ongoing use, and normal operations, there is a QControl subsystem, which will break some of the work up into more other subsystems. Probably not going to make a huge difference to us when we're just playing with this thing as a single user box to play around. But I think typically you would use the QCuddle controlling subsystem. So we'll just make that change. That'll take effect on the next IPL. And that's probably close to what we need. One other setting is, Q auto VRT, auto configure virtual devices. So if you forget to set this, you are going to try to connect with your 5250 emulator to the machine, and it's just going to hang up on you and never even prompt you for login. And you're going to be wondering, what's going wrong? And that's because by default, there are no virtual terminal devices created on the system. So basically, when you telnet into the system, you do a TN 5250 connection. There are no virtual devices to act as virtual terminals to service that request. So the easiest way to deal with that is to just let the system automatically create virtual devices as necessary. So there's this Q auto VRT system value that you can change, which defaults to 0. And you can either say no max, it will create as many are needed, but that could open you up to a denial of service attack or a remote resource exhaustion type attack. So again, it's just me. So I feel like 10 virtual devices are more than enough. So I'll just go ahead and set that to 10. And now, as needed for any simultaneous TN5250 connections into the machine, it will go ahead and create the virtual devices to handle those. CCS ID is the coded character set. These are some of the same code pages as the mainframe uses, the same EBCDIC code pages. So number 37, for example, is the United States American English code page. I'll just set it to 37. I don't know that this particularly matters, but this will just set it globally system-wide so that you don't have to set it if a particular job needs code page 37 specifically. So I tend to set that just assuming that, yeah, that's the code page I'll pretty much use for everything on the system. So those are the system values. The last thing I will do here is get it on the network. I think that's probably something that you'll want to do when you finish the installation. So to get it on the network, we need to create an Ethernet line resource and tie it to the actual Ethernet port on the machine's physical adapter, in this case, virtual Ethernet controller. So first we need to see what is the Ethernet device. So we're going to work with hardware resources. So that's WRK HDW RSC. And if I hit enter here, it's going to say I need a parameter. What type of resource do I want to work with? And that's going to be a communication resource, communication hardware. So star CMN, Charlie, Mike, November. Hit enter. This is going to list all of your communication adapters in the system. And a lot of these, I think, are just sort of internal virtual type things. But if you look, you'll see one of them is the Ethernet port. And that is CMN03. So make a mental note of that or write that down. Our Ethernet port is CMN03. Hit F3 to exit. And we'll use the create line Ethernet command. So CRTLINETH. This takes some parameters, so you can hit F4 to prompt it. And we'll give it a name. I'm just going to call this, I don't know, ETH1, kind of Unix style names. The resource name, this is the resource that we are creating this Ethernet line on. And that is that CMN03, whatever the name of the Ethernet port was we saw on the previous screen. We'll hit enter. It will ask us for some additional details. We'll just accept all the defaults. This will be online at IPL. Hit enter. You get more questions. Hit enter again. And it has created line description ETH1. Perfect. So now we can use the configure TCP command, CFG TCP. We'll hit enter. And this takes us into a menu with a bunch of TCP/IP configuration options. So we're going to work with TCP/IP interfaces, number 1. And we have our loopback interface, just like IP stacks on every other operating system. And we're going to add, so line option 1, to add a new entry at this line. And we'll give it an internet address of 192.168.42. What are we up to? We used 45 for the service tools, so we'll use 46, the next one in line. When I hit enter, we'll get to the add TCP/IP interface screen here. So it's pre-populated that address that I gave it. The line description for this interface is that ETH1 line that we just created. I can give it a subnet mask here, 255.255.255.0. And that should be all the information we need. So I'll just hit enter here. And you can see TCP/IP interface added successfully. It is an Ethernet LAN type on ETH1. Confirm that that IP looks good. Yep. So if I go ahead and now on that line do number 9 to start it, hit enter. It'll take a second and then it should start that interface up. Okay, there we go. User QSecOff started IP interface .46 on ETH1. So I'll hit F3 to escape out of that menu. And now we need to add our default route, our gateway. So that's number 2 to work with TCP/IP routes. And there are no routes in the system right now. So we're going to add a route, and the destination here is asterisk DFT, and then the word route spelled out for default route. So this is a good example of what I was talking about earlier in the system values, where there are often symbolic names you can use in addition to literal string values, right? Because I might just type in an IP address here for some subnet that I want to add a route for. And that would be a literal value that I'm passing into this parameter. But then there are these symbolic values that have special meaning. And those are what are usually indicated by that asterisk. So default route is a special symbolic name here that this command takes. It's actually passed to the add TCP/IP route command. Our subnet mask here, we'll use that symbolic value none, because this is my default route. We don't have a subnet mask. It's 0.0.0.0 essentially. And so there's a symbolic name to represent that. Next hop is my router address, 192.168.42.1. And I can hit enter there. And now you can see I have a default route to that next hop. We'll hit F3. And then most of the stuff you don't need to worry about will page down. Sorry, we won't page down. It's actually on this page. Number 12 is the TCP/IP domain information. So this is name server DNS stuff. So we'll go 12 to change TCP/IP domain information. We can tell what our host name is. So that may show up as the host name more on the Unix side of things. Our domain name, I'm home.mattwilson.org here. Domain search list if you want extra ones. This is the page where we need to page down. And on the second page is where you give it your name server addresses. So you can have up to 3 here. I'll do 192.168.42.5 and 192.168.42.2, which are my DNS servers in my home network here. I'll hit enter. And that's all the configuration we need to do for TCP/IP. So the last step is to just start TCP up. So you can do strtcp as the command. It takes some parameters, so hit F4 to prompt it. And you can see here that actually the defaults probably are okay for us. We'll just accept yes for all of the parameters. Start the application server, start the interfaces. I don't think we have any point-to-point profiles, but it doesn't start them. And just for good measure, it'll start IPv6. So go ahead and hit enter. And you can see that start TCP started for the user. Whenever there's a plus here, that means there's more lines of text in the status line. So you can actually click down into the status line or use the arrow keys to get your cursor down there, and then hit the page down key to see the additional lines. And you'll see that the next line and the last line, because there's no longer a plus here, was that start TCP completed successfully. So with luck, I'm going to sign off the console here. And I'm actually going to close the console entirely. Because we have console takeover, we can reopen the console and reconnect to it. But now if I just start a regular, actually this won't work. Let me edit my system configurations, OS 400. So when Access Client Solutions tries to connect to the regular TN 5250 session, it uses the system name as the DNS name of the system. I haven't added anything called OS 400 into my DNS server. So you can actually override that by going to the connection tab. And on IP address lookup frequency, you can say never, and then you can just hard code the IP address to connect to this system. So 192.168.42.46 was what we gave the system. And you can see here the console you still connect to on .45. So this is for our actual communication with the operating system, not just with the console. So we'll hit OK. We can close that. And now if we do our 5250 emulator, it'll prompt for sign in. And we can make this bigger here. And now you see this is just our regular telnet connection, essentially our 5250 emulator to our machine on its actual IP address in the operating system. So I'll use the sign-on screen. You may ask, didn't you just enter a sign-on? Yeah, the Access Client Solutions actually makes another sort of behind-the-scenes connection to IBM I that is their own sort of client access protocol. And so that's what that first sign-on was for. But now I'm essentially in just a telnet session, telnet 5250 to the operating system. So I'm now getting the sign-on screen for that. So we're able to log in, and we're now on one of those virtual terminal devices that is created to handle the incoming network connections to interactive sessions. So that's it. I'm going to sign off now. And just to confirm, if we go back here, we're done with the virtual IO server. Just to prove that it's on the network from everywhere, I should be able to ping that system's IP address, and sure enough, I can. And I can actually, I can FTP to that machine now. It has a built-in FTP server with the default TCP/IP services. So QSEC OFR can sign in to the FTP server, and we're defaulting in, I don't know, just, are we in QSys here or something? Maybe QProgrammer. So yeah, the system is up and running. What you are planning to do with your IBM I installation from this point is as good of guess as anybody's, but you are installed, up and running. You have it running in a partition on your IVM. We probably got logged out here, but oh no, we're still logged in. So you can see it's up and running, and we're just at the regular 000 reference code here. If you click into the edit the details, you'll see that it should now match, IPL source B, key lock position normal. So as we changed that on the virtual control panel, that's an attribute of that machine, of this partition. So that's reflected here. So normally, if you're starting your Power server back up and these partitions are shut down, you can just come in here, hit the check mark next to your partitions, hit the activate button, and then it'll just automatically, again, as long as your, come on, there we go. As long as your key lock position is normal and your IPL source is B, this thing will just automatically IPL. The TCP/IP services will start automatically. So you can just hit the button, wait a few minutes, and then you'll be able to start making connections into your IBM I partition. So we'll close that. We don't need to save the current configuration there. You can quit out of access services. And that's it. That concludes the major parts of this video series on getting your Power server up and running. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, feel free to leave comments below. Thanks for sticking with it through this whole series, if you indeed did that. And if you have any ideas for things you'd like to see videos about in the IBM Power universe, since this channel is mainframes and more, we are allowed to venture outside of just our ZOS and MVS 3.8 videos, outside the mainframe realm into this mid-range realm with IBM I and the Power systems. So if there's, like I said, any ideas, anything you'd like to see, feel free to drop a message to me below in the comments. And otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this video series. Goodbye.